Good morning to everybody. This is Vilnius calling everybody who are registered and joined our Vilnius Consultations 2020. I'm Virginia Budienes, the director of Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. And this is already third Vilnius Consultations, thanks to the new world of technology. In this pandemic world, we can come together on online platform and talk and do consultations on different topics. This year's Vilnius Consultations that we are organizing is under the title, Is it the End of the World as We Know It? Security and Resilience in Post-Pandemic Recovery. And we will have 3 sessions, 1 session per week. Today we have the discussion, consultation, changing nature of US global leadership, implications for resilience and the NATO in the NATO Eastern Flank. And I want to thank everybody who are interested in joining us in this discussion. And also I'm happy that not only the safety in the pandemic or post-pandemic, not yet post-pandemic world, is not the only issue that interests us. We face solidarity in terms of what's happening in the world around us, especially for Lithuania and Latvia. It's important that things in our neighborhood in Belarus is happening. But today is about US leadership and changing nature of it. I would like now to pass moderation to our dear Emilia Pundziūtė-Galiuā, and she will be moderating and giving floor to keynote speaker and other panelists, and she will tell you more details on how we will proceed. Emilia.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, prominent panelists. Thank you very much for joining us today on this beautiful morning. It is beautiful in Paris. I hope it's beautiful everywhere else. September 11th, so we are commemorating the atrocious terrorist acts of 2001, and our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And our eyes this morning are on the United States, as we discuss the changing nature of the US global leadership and the implications for NATO's Eastern Flank. Thank you very much for the Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis for organizing this event, and thanks to the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, which is funding these consultations. So over the past several years, we have been witnessing serious messages sent from the American leadership about the shifting priorities in the United States foreign policy, the abrupt withdrawal from the military theaters in the Middle East, recomposition of the United States military presence in Europe. We saw turbulence in the domestic American politics. The world is holding its breath before the presidential election. So we are here to discuss the implications of these events to our region on the eastern border of NATO. And we have with us today the 3 prominent panelists. We have Edward Lucas, who is a writer and consultant specializing in the European and transatlantic security. He's also a formerly senior editor at The Economist, and today a non-resident senior fellow at the Center of European Policy Analysis. We have Žaneta Ozolina, who is a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science at the University of Latvia. She chairs the Foreign Affairs Council of the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a member of the European Council of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations. And we also have Dr. Martin Swarovski, who is the head of the Security Strategies Program and senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy. And he's also a former high-ranking diplomat of the Czech Republic. So if you allow, dear colleagues, to my mind, we are confronted today with three major questions. First is, how likely is the American disengagement from the Europe today? Partial or full disengagement? And from what you read in your analysis, what shape would it take? Second, is Europe ready and capable of ensuring a degree of strategic autonomy within the transatlantic partnership or alone, and is it willing to work towards it, and how could this be achieved? And third, what should be the strategies of the countries of our own region in Central Europe and in the Baltic States? Should we continue to lobby the Americans to maintain the presence in Europe, or should we creatively think about strengthening European alliances? So I will invite first Edward Lucas to give some keynote thoughts, and then I will invite Professor Ozolina and Dr. Swarovski to give their own considerations. The floor is yours, Edward.
Good. Well, labas ritus visiems, and Achu, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't be in Vilnius, but this is, if not the next best thing, it's at least close. And I commend the organisers for their foresight in organising this series, and the topic today is indeed particularly topical. I also feel I need to thank all Lithuanians for your leadership, because we face a enormously inspiring but also difficult problem in Belarus with the democratic uprising there, which for many of us is evocative of the events we witnessed from 1988 to 1991 in neighboring countries. And we see Lithuania as absolutely in the forefront of the international response. It's you that are giving shelter to the people who've been persecuted. It's your foreign minister who's taking the diplomatic initiative, chivying his colleagues to do more. I had lunch with Minister Linkevičius in London yesterday, and he was just on his way to go and see our Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. So I think this is Lithuania had an opportunity here and has seized it in an admirable way. I also note that September the 11th is the anniversary of the start of the Lithuanian Civil War of 1389 and the Teutonic Knights' siege of Vilnius. But I think that has no particular significance for today's discussion. But the crisis just across the border really does, because it's so striking that the US is not in the lead. If this had happened in the Bush administration, if it happened in the Clinton administration, I think even if it had happened in the Obama administration, you would have seen the American embassy in Minsk doing the sort of things that some of the other embassies are doing, sheltering Svetlana Alexievich, making vigorous diplomatic protests. You'd have had the whole weight of American diplomacy involved, perhaps in mediation efforts, perhaps in telling the Kremlin to keep out, perhaps in putting direct pressure on the regime, perhaps in helping the democratic protesters, perhaps in all of the above. But there would have been engagement. We just don't see that. We see some words from Secretary of State Pompeo. We've seen nothing from the White House. We've also incidentally seen very little on the Navalny poisoning, which is another huge issue, the use of illegal chemical weapons on the territory of the Russian Federation against a citizen of the Russian Federation. This has had a kind of political earthquake in Germany. It's really, I hope, woken the Germans up a bit on what's on the true nature of the regime in Russia. But again, no American leadership. When President Trump was asked about this, he said, well, it sounds bad, but shouldn't we be talking about China? And you can't imagine any previous American president responding in that way. So Emilia came up with three questions. How likely is US disengagement? Can Europe ensure strategic autonomy? And what should the Baltic states do about it? So I think the first thing to point out here is that although there are specific aspects of the Trump administration's approach to transatlantic security, which we should be worried about, this is not a completely new trend. I remember very clearly the Obama administration and the numerous occasions on which we complained vigorously about the Obama administration's neglect of its Central and Eastern European allies. Some of you will remember the reset, possibly defensible diplomatic gambit, but which certainly didn't play out successfully, which involved some deplorable arm twisting of the allies, for example, trying to make Poland invite Russia to the Community of Democracies conference in Krakow, with the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who now is revered as a great Atlanticist and friend of the region, saying to the Poles, we want to sort things out with Russia, get with the program or pay the consequences. There was the pivot to Asia, a kind of explicit turning away of the of US attention from European allies towards rising challenges in Asia. I remember an open letter, indeed, I think signed by many people from the Baltic States and Poland and other countries, complaining about the Obama administration's neglect of the region. And I would argue even before that, the way in which the Iraq war and before that the war in Afghanistan played out also showed something of a disregard for Central and Eastern Europe. To some extent we paid, or you in the region and your friends paid the price of the intense focus of the Bush administration on those wars and the huge sacrifices in lives and in treasure and in political capital that came with them. So I think we tend sometimes to think of the era of sort of 1998 to 2000 as if that was normal. The late Clinton administration was a very good time for Atlanticists and for the region, and we felt we had the wind of history in our sails, but that was actually a rather brief golden age, and we shouldn't regard that as being set in concrete. So disappointment and strain and tension and fragmentation are actually the normal condition of the Atlantic Alliance. I grew up in the 70s, and I remember then France wasn't part of the NATO command structure. We had huge differences with the United States on a range of issues. That's much more close to normal in historical terms than this brief golden age we remember. And I have to say, if I was American, I would be tempted to support the broad outline of the Trump administration's approach. A friend of mine who served in the administration for a while in a senior role supporting the Atlantic Alliance was trying to explain to his father what he did. And his father was a farmer from the south of the United States. And he said, so we're defending these countries, aren't they rich? Germany, isn't that rich? And that's a pretty profound insight. Why is the United States sacrificing or taking political risks, sacrificing money, putting its counters on the board in Europe for countries that could perfectly well afford to defend themselves? Europe is bigger than the United States in population terms. It's richer than the United States in GDP terms. Why do we need this American security blanket? Now, there are good arguments on the other side, but I think we have to start off rather and be honest about this. We start off that we have to make the case, and if we don't make the case and we don't back that case up with our actions, then the tide is in the other way. It goes the other way. The memories that I grew up with of the Berlin airlift, Kennedy's speech in Berlin, the crushing of the Prague Spring, the revolutions of 1989. For the modern generation of Americans who are now born after 1989, this doesn't have the same relevance. They're demographically different, they're generationally different, and we are fighting a bit of a, I wouldn't say a losing battle, but the tilt is against us. But there are particular things about the Trump administration which we have to take on board, which are sharply different. And I think there's three things. One is spontaneity. The president starts the day with a blank sheet of paper. He watches Fox News, he looks at Twitter, and then he comes out with things. So the United States that we grew up with, of very highly developed, rather bureaucratic, minutely detailed policy evolution and implementation, is history. It's not, I mean, those processes still happen. In some bits of government, they still work, but when it comes to the White House the president basically starts the day with an empty desk, and we don't know at the beginning of the day what he will have said or done by the end of the day. That's a big change. We are dealing with this sort of spontaneous policy making. Second, it's highly personalized. Personal relations really matter. When President Trump is asked about things, he says things like, I don't know the guy. I love the guy. I know the guy. The guy's disappointed me. May sometimes be a woman as well, but it's more often a guy. And that is extremely important. If we're dealing with the White House, we need to build personal ties and personal ties with the president. And the trouble with that is it's easier for big countries to build personal ties than it is small ones. The chance of a prime minister, president, foreign minister from the Baltic States managing to strike a personal relationship with President Trump is tricky. You may have more luck if you're German or French or perhaps even Russian or Chinese. So personalized politics is bad news for small countries. And the third is it's very transactional. The idea is, I've done something for you, what are you going to do for me? Now, that's not all bad, because there's stuff that we can do for the United States, and the Poles brilliantly realized that they could massage the president's ego by calling the new base Fort Trump. And that was a stunning piece of diplomacy in the era, in this new era. It cost almost nothing. There's just two words, Fort Trump, add a third word, Poland. And that has put, and perhaps add another one, a number, 2%. And in Trump's universe, this is the country that spends money on defense. They want an American base, and they've named it after him. And that is pretty much all you need to know. You don't need to think about logistics, how are we going to get the troops to Poland, how do they fit into NATO contingency plans, are they going to be on a rotating base, or is this a permanent base? All that's kind of details, leave that to ESPA. Fort Trump, Poland, 2%. So you need that very transactional, very simple understanding. And what he understands about Germany is big, rich country, doesn't pay 2%. As he puts it, they're delinquent. So that's the era we're in. We just have to accept that. But on the other hand, some things haven't really changed. There's still enormous institutional weight in the State Department, in the intelligence community, in the Pentagon, the Defense Department, behind the Atlantic Alliance. And we have Congress, and Congress is still strongly Atlanticist. And in a way, the fact that the Trump administration is difficult from a transatlantic point of view helps us, because the Republicans want to ease their guilty conscience by stressing the importance of transatlantic defense and security, and the Democrats want to stress transatlantic defense and security because it's a way of bashing the Trump administration. And I find it quite interesting that left-wing Democrats who were not natural security hawks, when I meet them and talk to them, are now very keen to talk about the evils of Vladimir Putin and the importance of solidarity with our European allies, and even have quite interesting positive things to say about Ukraine, because they see that Ukraine has become part of the political mix. So we have assets, we have things that we can do on that front. But there is a fundamental problem, that credibility at the top is lacking. And President Trump is quoted as saying, when it was explained to him what Article 5 was about, he said, what, so if Russia attacks Lithuania, we have to go to war against Russia? That's crazy. Now, he didn't say that in front of the cameras, but that sounds to me like Trump talking. And that's pretty troubling from our point of view. Your point of view as Lithuanian, from my point of view as someone who counts himself as an honorary Lithuanian, wants to see you and the other Baltic states safe and at peace. Now, there's obviously a lot of hope riding on Biden victory on November the 3rd. And I think that to some extent that will put the clock back. Biden is a friend of the Baltic states. He's a friend of the Transatlantic Alliance. He gets it. As vice president, he would fly to Bosnia just for the day to try and repair some disintegrating part of the Dayton peace agreement, to bang some heads together. So he has transatlantic security in his bones. And although there are some people in the Biden camp who say this would be a good chance to reset relations with Russia, and there's been a notorious open letter on that saying that we need to reopen arms control talks and others with Russia, I think that's a nuance rather than a big shift. So it may be, if we're lucky, we get a Biden administration that goes back to a kind of a business as usual. But I still think those underlying issues are there. China is a bigger threat than Russia. There's no two ways about it. If you're an American, you've got limited diplomatic time, limited effort, limited money to expend. You're going to be thinking, how do we counter the rise of Xi Jinping's China? And at some point, you may have to say we can't afford to do everything we want to do in Europe, or we may have to make some hard choices. We need the Russians on board for this, and maybe we're going to reach out to the Russians, and if they want something, we'll see if we can give it to them. Those calculations will still be there. It would be nice to think that the European Union is rising smoothly to fill the gap. And I have to say, obviously I was extremely disappointed by Brexit, and I wish it hadn't happened. But I don't feel that the common security and defence policy of the European Union is in any shape to take over. I'm not sure that Britain's departure damages it particularly. In a way, maybe Britain's departure will focus minds more on making this happen. But it isn't happening. The leadership from the European Union over Belarus has been shockingly weak. The post-COVID European budget has cut money from the areas of the European Defence Fund and other things that were most needed. Military mobility, absolutely vital. Defence research, absolutely vital. So we see neither words nor deeds on the European side of anything like what we might need for strategic autonomy, or even something less than that, perhaps just strategic credibility or strategic resilience. So I don't think we're going to see a kind of big bang answer from the European Union to fill this gap, which is growing, the transatlantic security gap, which is growing. So what do we do about it? Well, I think there's a strategic answer and there's a tactical answer. The strategic answer is to say that we are part of the answer on China. And if you want to constrain China, and I think that is now taken widely as the great goal for all the big Western industrial countries and the big democracies. So whether you're from Japan to India to Australia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, there's a growing realization that we face a really difficult time with Xi Jinping's China. And we're going to need to make some hard choices about how to do it. If we're going to do that, the economic governance is immensely important. We need to put the billion-plus people of East Asia, North America, and Europe together, which is still the majority of the world's GDP, and make it into a rule setter on technical standards, a rule setter on data, rule setter on things like 5G, the role of Huawei, maybe also a rule setter on how academic research works, on intellectual freedom on campuses, on a whole range of the business model of higher education. There's a whole range of things where we need very wide-ranging rule setting and norm setting to deal with China's challenges. And we're part of that. America is not strong enough to deal with China on its own. It needs allies. And that is a bleak truth for an administration that believes in America first. But America first, if it means America alone, means America loses. America can only do this with its allies, and they have not successfully engaged with allies on this, or not very successfully so far. But I think that is the absolute bleak truth of this. They're going to have to do it. And we have to show that we're on board with that. We may have some differences about some things. We may say, no, that's an idea, but we've got a better idea, or that's a priority, but this is a bigger priority. So we will have a robust, but I think constructive, transatlantic and trans-Pacific security discussion. But we basically need to put back what we lost in the discussion of TTIP. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership floundered because there was worries in Europe about American hormone-treated beef and the impact of some American products and services on the European market, and it floundered in America because there was no appetite for for more free trade deals. But we need to go revisit TTIP and say we want a transatlantic economic security pact. And it may be not very big on trade liberalization, but it will be very strong on economic standards and economic governance, and it will basically be aimed at China. On a small scale, we've got the 3 Seas initiative. That's a kind of mini version of that, just dealing with connectivity between the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Baltic Seas. That's coming up in the summit of that. For that is coming up in Tallinn next month, I have to say I'm not wildly impressed with the Estonian stewardship of this project, but I hope that I will be impressed as the weeks go by and we get closer to that. But these sort of collective economic security models, whether they're on a small scale like 3Cs or on a large scale like a revived Transatlantic Security Pact, this is where you get attention in Washington. And I've been in the room in Washington where people have said, China is eating our lunch in Eastern Europe. What are we going to do about it? We really worry about the 17+1. The 16+1 becomes 17+1. Countries like Italy signing up for BRI, Hungary, Greece, other countries getting very chummy with China. This is bad. What are we going to do? Okay, here's the answer, 3Cs. And that's why we had the previous 3Cs, the previous but one 3C summit in Romania and the one before that in Warsaw, very high level American attendance. So that's a strategic approach to getting American attention to our security. Because if we're playing part in the economic security of the West against China, then you're in a much better position to say, oh, here's what we need in terms of other forms of security against the threat from Russia. And then there's the tactical response. And the tactical response, I think, is to try and plug the gap with what we've got. Now, maybe you can't rely on the European Union at the moment as a security partner. That is certainly the assessment at the moment, my assessment at the moment. But if you're worried about northeastern Europe, there's a really important statistic here. If you take the 5 Nordics, which is basically 4 Nordics because Iceland's so small, but take the 5 Nordics, the 3 Baltics and Poland and put them together, their GDP is bigger than the Russian Federation's. Their defense spending is about half the Russian Federation's. But the Russian Federation, with its defense spending, needs to pay for a blue water navy, which we don't need. It needs to pay for a strategic nuclear program, which we don't need. It needs to pay for defending the Russian Federation's landmass against the threat from the east. So if we just spent the defense budget of the Nordic, Baltic, Polish 9 more effectively, that alone would be a very powerful answer to any military threat from China. Now, if you add to the Nordic, Baltic, Polish 9 the fact that the Brits are interested, you might have some French participation, probably get a bit of Dutch participation. That kind of coalition of the willing and capable would be more than enough, I think, to deal with any conceivable threat from Russia. So the point here is that our worries about security in northeastern Europe are not a problem of means. They're a problem of willpower and coordination. During the Cold War, we really did have problems of means that we felt weaker. The Soviet Union was a really serious military power and a really serious economic power, and particularly in the 50s, Europe was weak and disorganized, and there was a serious worry. It's not the same now. We are losing, insofar as we are losing, not because we're weak, because we're weak-willed and we're weakly organized. And the answer to that is to improve our willpower and improve our organization. And I think one can do that on a Nordic, Baltic, Polish level. There's a big question about what one does with Germany. If you bring Germany in, you get huge extra capability, but on the other hand, you may slow down decision making because the Germans may see things differently in time of a crisis. But I think that we're going to see a lot more attention to Nordic, Baltic and Polish cooperation. If you haven't read it already, I commend the Atlantic Council study by Hans Binnendijk and a colleague, which came out in February, looking at strategic incoherence in the region. And for the Baltic states, this is going to mean rethinking the importance of the NATO, non-NATO divide. Because so far, the approach in the Baltic states has been that the most important thing is to have NATO troops on the ground in the Baltic states. That's what matters. Canadians, Brits, Germans, others, that's the key thing, and fitting into NATO contingency planning. And I think that there's now a question mark over that because there's a question mark over the desk in the Oval Office. If you cannot be sure that in the event of a crisis, the president is going to, excuse that's the doorbell in the background, that the president is going to make the political decisions you want, you need some fallbacks, you need some plan Bs and plan C and plan D. And I think that the integration, the closer integration of Sweden and Finland into regional security planning in all sorts of ways, bringing in Britain as a non-EU but NATO power, I think through the Northern Group. That is probably going to be the security answer. And there's one more thing, which is particularly difficult for the Baltic states, that the greatest strategic incoherence, I would argue, in the region is not actually the NATO, non-NATO divide, but lack of coordination between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this has always been something, I think, of a the further away you are from the Baltic states, the better the cooperation seems. But I think that, that there's going to be tremendous pressure from the outside for much tighter coordination within the Baltic states on all sorts of military and security issues. And because that will be the price for keeping the outside world focused and interested and enthusiastic. So I think that's the end of my time, and I look forward very much to a vigorous discussion, and thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your interesting remarks. You actually point out several very important things, like for example, the importance to understand the diplomatic style in Washington and possibility to play within the political elite and administration, and to probably build certain alliances that would be useful to us. Then the idea that we should work together with the United States on the China policy and involve the United States in this. And then, of course, the possibility of the regional approach. Your diagnosis of the European capabilities are rather grim. I would wonder what the Baltic states and the countries in the region should do with the other actors within the European Union, because developing a regional approach is might lead to division within the Transatlantic Alliance and within Europe as well. And how do we respond to other countries like France and Germany, like France, which would probably be happy about the distancing from the United States. But I guess we will have time to return to this. I'm sorry for raising these these questions, and I remind our public that you can also think of your questions and write them down in the Q&A section, which is or the chat section. There's a special section in your Zoom where you can write your questions already. So that's an advantage of electronic devices that we're using today. So you mentioned also the importance of the coordination between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And we have a professor from Latvia, Žaneta Ozolne, whom I would invite to give her remarks for about 10 minutes, if I may.
Thank you, Emilia, and thank you, Vilnius Policy Analysis Institute, for organizing this event and also inviting me to share some thoughts on so important issue as US leadership. And I can definitely agree with Edward's analysis of where the US leadership stands today and how relevant it was, and it is not only for Latvia, but for security of the Baltic states at large. And if we look back into our history, then to a very large extent, our security and also our state of defense is very much because of US involvement and US support, building our national armed forces, drafting our strategies, and more and more and more. So therefore, indeed, Latvia, together with its Baltic friends, is following where Mr. Trump stands today and what our future prospects. On the one hand, we could say that indeed the US global presence decreased because of Trump's administration, because of some cleavages in foreign and security policy of the states. But on the other hand, still, if we look from the alliance perspective, then the US is still there. And even if the narrative of 2% of GDP is dominating in this field, but to be honest, indeed, this is a problem. We cannot build a credible, strong, and influential transatlantic community without increasing defense spending. Even in absolute figures, of course, 1 point and something of Germany's defense budget is much bigger than defense budget of many other countries. But still, it is some kind of a political commitment. What are future prospects of defense in all member states? There is another one point which I wanted to mention. If we look from political perspective, then definitely US presence in the Baltics and also Latvia is decreasing. But if we look at the practical level, military level, then Americans are very much present and very much involved in strengthening the defensibility of all three Baltic states. So more American troops on the Baltic states, on the Baltic land, it means more security and more stability. However, with the situation in the United States in last 3.5 years, there is a certain psychological or political, even political shift in three Baltic states, because we used to be named as strong allies and strong American supporters in NATO. Very often in the EU we're called pro-Americans, transatlanticists, and more. But in recent years, so the psychological shift is taking place in the direction of the EU. And even I noticed that more and more on political discussions level, such term as Euro-Atlanticism is more dominating than transatlanticism. So Europe plays more important roles than before. And even in security and defense sector, EU discussions are taken more seriously. I agree with Ed in a sense that EU CFSP policy, CSDP policy is very weak. There are a lot of shortages, a lot of empty spaces in text. But at the same time, starting from 2014, the commitment of European member states to pursue more policies, more cooperative efforts to put forward different political instruments, they are at least signs that this is not an empty space anymore. And here I come to another point, that the state of transatlantic relations or the state of Euro-Atlantic relations to a very large extent depend on the commitment of member states, EU member states, to commit themselves to European security and defense policy. So far, European Commission is playing a political leadership role, putting on the table more and more different initiatives. But when it comes to member states' commitment to those initiatives, then we of course see very diverse picture. And this diverse picture actually has its impact also on relations within NATO. Another point which I would like also to put here on the table, that if we look at how the Baltic states perceive the United States, then it's very much still dominated by security and defense realm. But in recent year, particularly because of COVID, there are more and more discussions about enhancement of economic relations. And what Edward also mentioned, the TTIP is one of those issues which again become very, very important. So therefore, let us see either with Biden or with Trump, again after November the 3rd, let's see. I think TTIP will be one of those issues which will at least have some impact on relations between European countries and the US. And probably I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janetta. You also point out very important elements One of which is that the Baltic states feel the American presence still there. So we're wondering whether the American engagement in Europe is simply a reconfiguration maybe of its forces. It withdraws from Germany, but it's still present in the Baltic states. So maybe the picture is not that grim. And another issue that you mentioned is also the diversity among the European countries, whether there is a possibility to actually harmonize the views of different European countries, and that's something that we could probably work towards. So I guess we will be able to return to it after our different discussions. Thank you very much. And since the NATO's Eastern Flank, it's not only the Baltic states, we have been talking about our region very much, but it's also the Central European states, and they very often work together with the Baltic states. So it would be very interesting to hear the Czech perspective on the issue, and I invite Mr. Martin Swarovski to give his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Emilia. I listened very carefully to the analysis provided by Edward and Janeta, and it was very interesting for me. I can say that I agree with the majority of what has been said, not all, but vast majority. But since we do not have a time probably for this discussion about our assessment of the current state of play, I would maybe start in the item that I see consensus among us, and this is what Edward said, that Europe should be a part of the strategic answer to China problem, right? I fully agree with this, and Edward concentrated on the economy and on some what we can name as a setting some standards. I would add something to the same topic in terms of military domain, because I think Europe should be also part of the strategic answer to China problem in the military domain. And if we are really a part of this answer, I think it will not be just for the sake of coping with China and for the sake of the United States, but it will increase our own role. It will be, let's say, some assurance of keeping relevance of NATO for United States, which is very important. My I think answer and the solution is rather more in terms of division of roles. I think that the answer should be a proper division of roles between the United States and NATO. Maybe not so much about the engagement there on the spot, what was mentioned here by Edward. I can imagine engagement on the spot that is already going on in terms of Great Britain and France. But in terms of NATO, I would rather opt for the proper division of role, which will increase our importance and increases importance of the resilience of the NATO Eastern Flank. United States are becoming overstretched, and I think they are saying bluntly that they need Europe for deterrence of Russia in order to have their hands unbound for China. I would accept this, and I think it is not in contradiction with transactional approach. But I think it requires, if we should be part of this answer in military domain, it will require some changes in NATO doctrine, strategy, and also capabilities. But as I said, it can be of advance of us. It can be advantage for increasing our resilience vis-a-vis Russia. Why? Because Russia has a vast military potential, as well as China, no doubt about that. But both countries have very similar limitations, mainly in terms of the ability to project power. So they simply do not have so far the ability to project power. In case of China, it will come because they have enough resources for that. So therefore, nowadays, the strategy of China as well as Russia is concentrating on limited warfare and on the tactic that we call a fait accompli scenario. So in both cases, they are concentrating on the very initial stage of the conflict with the aim to cause a strategic shock to the enemy and then to negotiate. That means to create a fait accompli scenario. So if you analyze their capabilities, their strategies, and the expression of their leadership, it's clear in both cases. As I said, in China, in 10, 15 years, it may be different. Now, it is the same in some cases. That means the answer to topical risk represented by China and Russia is the same. Therefore, if NATO will have some streamlining of this defense planning process and change of some strategy, it can be also convenient in terms of its resilience vis-a-vis Russia. What I mean by that, I see here 4 main tasks for NATO being able to be part of this strategic answer. I just name them, maybe then stop and we can discuss later on. So I think the first, NATO needs to increase substantially its Navy capacity. We need to invest more in our Navy, also taking into account that we have a financial base for it. Because United States are already overstretched in terms of the deep blue Navy, because they have like 11 aircraft carriers. Out of them, only 8 are in the relevant technical shape, and there are always very difficult debate whether to place those aircraft carriers in Middle East and Indo-Pacific region or East Mediterranean. Plus, Russia is using relatively cheap capabilities in order to overstretch the United States and NATO. I mean, sending submarines to Eastern Mediterranean or armor their icebreakers in Arctic. So the tactics is to overstretch the United States. So NATO needs to help the United States and it needs to invest more in Navy. The first. Second, I think it is second task is what I call enhance European level of ambition within NATO. Within NATO. So the fact is that the majority of combat brigades inside NATO, these are European brigades, not the United States brigades. So the Europe possesses majority of the combat brigades. What is the problem? That we are not Europeans. We are not able to deploy them and to sustain them in the theater. So Europe needs to invest more in combat support and combat support service in order to make the combat brigades plausible. So bluntly speaking, NATO mission in Afghanistan without US logistic would fail. We need to change that. 4 or 3 is what I mentioned at the beginning. Our ability to cope with this fait accompli scenario requires new kind of capabilities. Make it short, we need more capabilities in terms of rapid penetration from high distance. Because this A-to-A-D system of Russia and Chinese are very quick and very high readiness. So we need to penetrate them from the high distance. So we are speaking about long-range missiles. We are speaking about stealth and unmanned capabilities, which cost a lot of money. So United States are now concentrating in those capabilities, and maybe we should try to streamline a bit our NATO defense planning process in these capabilities that, what I said at the beginning, are can be useful in case of China, as well as in encountering Russian A to AD system in the Baltic States. And then the fourth, it is what we can call soft security. That means sharing intelligence, our tactics on hybrid threats, and so on, so forth. We need to substantially increase pace of political decision-making process inside NATO, because the fait accompli strategy implied by both Russia and China counts on our inability to take rapidly political decisions, even in time of the conflict. So the last sentence for me is that Russians and Chinese precisely know, I mean, now it's more possible in terms of Russia, because China does not have so far military strategy vis-a-vis Europe. But the Russians precisely know, and they are right in their assessment, that in the NATO, even though it is the strongest military alliance in the world, some military measures, even in time of the conflict, still require political decision. Even in time of conflict, and political decision based on consensus. And I think they are aiming on this vulnerable point. So to sum it up, being a part of strategic answer on China in military domain can be also beneficial for our resilience vis-a-vis Russia. I stop that.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you also for bringing up the Russia dimension, which is very relevant to our region. And the question is whether it has the same relevance to other actors within the transatlantic community, the United States and other European countries as well. So it looks like you also brought up some very concrete, serious questions, such as military capabilities and the necessity for Europe to have bigger ambitions. The question which is still sort of nagging me is whether Europe is ready to actually work on this together. How is it possible for European powers to harmonize their positions and actually achieve this? This is the question. Sitting in Paris especially is something that comes into my mind. France is not necessarily that skeptical about NATO, but when you hear the President Macron speak, he speaks about the European security, European defense. So the question is how we can achieve this sort of division of roles within NATO, as you say. And it looks like we are aiming towards this, again, division of roles or division of regions. So I wonder whether this doesn't bring too much division into NATO and into our transatlantic community. So these are the two questions that I want to raise. I encourage the participants, the honorable public, to raise your own questions. We have the Q&A section in our Zoom platform. We also have a chat section, so whichever is more convenient for you. I'm not sure you can ask questions live, but you can certainly write them down, and I will ask them to our panelists. So if I may invite you to think first of all about the questions that I raised, and then we will continue with our discussions. Whoever would like to start, Martin.
Well, shall I?
Edward.
Yes, I think that we are in an era of division. I think the idea of a consensus in a NATO of 28 or 29 or a European Union of however it is, plus or minus Britain, we're not going to get a united policy on any of these big divisive issues because they're divisive. And we saw with President Macron's reset towards Russia a really sharp illustration of that. This was thought up in a Trumpian, spontaneous way, announced with no consultation with the Central and East European allies, and actually no consultation even with Germany. And I was at the Munich Security Conference in February in what seems like another century, where he came out with it again and had also blocked the accession talks for North Macedonia and Albania in another extraordinary display of French self-centeredness. And we just have to live with that. If France does its own thing, Germany does its own thing. Germany is still not willing to block Nord Stream. So there is you can't expect, I think, to have a. It's great when it works, but most of the time it doesn't. Now we see Cyprus blocking the EU consensus because of its worries about the row with Turkey. We've seen Hungary and Greece blocking the EU position on China because of their ties with China. And I think we can end up consuming huge amounts of political capital and time trying to reach consensus when most of the time it's not successful. So I think we need to think outside the box now. We need to say, where are the coalitions of the willing? Where are the coalitions of the capable? Perhaps most important, where are the coalitions of the threat aware? And if you take the Nordic 4 or 5, the Baltic 3 and Poland, those are countries which pretty much have the same approach now to Russia. They cross the NATO, non-NATO divide, they cross the EU, non-EU divide. But if you can go, Copenhagen perhaps is a bit of an outlier in one direction, but basically in the other 8 capitals, you go to security conferences there, go to foreign ministries, defense ministries, intelligence agencies, and they all think basically the same thing. Once you go further afield, you don't get that. You don't get that when you go, to the president of the Czech Republic. You certainly don't get that when you go to Berlin. You don't get that when you go to Brussels. So let's concentrate on the coalitions that we can build and start doing ad hoc practical things which immediately have the effect of increasing resilience, which in itself is a form of deterrence, of increasing capability, of creating capability not only that defends the region but can also be deployed elsewhere. So I'm sorry to disagree slightly with the Jeanette and others, but I think that and maybe this is a sort of pragmatic, what used to be the pragmatic British approach before my country went crazy. But let's look at the problems in front of us and the ingredients that we've got, and see if we can use the ingredients we've got to deal with the problems that are most pressing.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Martin.
Yes, I fully agree with Edward that regionalization and differences in threat assessment is matter of fact, is reality. Yes, we cannot, I think, even have the goal that big, powerful countries like Germany, France, or Great Britain will have the same threat assessment like our countries. So I think it's a matter of fact. In terms of using economic potential of Europe for also increasing security and resilience, what was our topic before, we simply need to have Germans on board. Right, we cannot antagonize Germans. So I'm belonging to, let's say, a pro-Atlantic community, but I'm always trying to argue that we should not antagonize Germans and we should use the economic strength. So we are conducting yearly a conference in Berlin. So this time it will be in October. And my thesis for the Germans, you need to be very diplomatic and cautious with them. But I think, and it is relating to your question, my thesis is that whether we like it or not, the great power competition is reality. And some countries like France and Great Britain already comprehended, and they are already doing bilaterally with the United States. They are deploying their capabilities to the Indo-Pacific region. They joined US efforts in this region. They are not speaking too loudly about it in the Brussels, but they are already there. So I think for us, or for Germans, there is a decision. Either it will be done, and I mean the coping with Chinese threat bilaterally, or in the coalition of willing, which is already the reality, or there will be a NATO answer. So the Germans can choose whether they will leave room for Great Britain and France to do it bilaterally, even under the surface, or where they would opt for NATO approach. And last sentence, I think that some bilateral solutions in Eastern Flank are needed, and they are not in contradiction with a NATO concept. They are not in contradiction with NATO article number 3. So I think what Poland does with Norway in terms of their missile capabilities capable to target a Russian Navy in St. Petersburg, what they are doing together with Sweden, they harmonize the plans of closing a Barents Sea in case of contingencies. It should be done throughout the region. So I'm trying now to have a couple of suggestions for bilateral Czech-Polish measures, regardless of invocation of article number 5. Because if there is a contingency, once it's sure that we need to start our, let's say, countermeasures even before the article number 5 is invoked. And in my understanding, it is not against the spirit of the North Atlantic Treaty. Other way around, it is a contribution to the NATO security.
Thank you very much. Janetta, what would be your take?
Yes, so when I was listening, Martin and also Edward, at one point I caught myself that they are presenting the picture in a way that the whole world acts on the basis of transatlantic community thinking. So that Washington Treaty is making like a framework for the whole world, which of course always is the case if you try to narrow down conversation and to find a focus. But the point is that for such a country as Latvia, and I think that for all 3 Baltic states, definitely the issue number 1 is to deal with problems more pressing. So that's what we were doing from the late 80s and early 90s. But at the same time, today's world is getting more and more complex. And it's relatively easy to find a solution, for better or for worse, in the situation when you know exactly where great powers, regional powers are standing. Today we cannot precisely explain, tell, predict how the triangle or whatever geometric figure will look like between such countries as US, China, Russia, and the EU. So these relations are very dynamic, and China can be friend with Russia one day and then appease the EU the next day. So the US as well, one day is big friend with the EU, Europeans are the biggest friends the next day, so Russia is a great power with a great leader. So those relations are shifting. So it means that one of solutions is exactly what Edward was mentioning before. These are regional settings. And those regional settings, on the one hand, are fixed, within the EU, fixed within NATO, but on the other hand, they are also in a state of flux. For instance, we can agree on defense with Poland very easily, but when it comes within the EU on democracy issues, then actually positions actually are quite different. So therefore, this explains why, and here I ally with Martin, that for Europeans, it's very important not to have a fixed picture of security and defense, but to look how the relations or different coalitions within the EU are forming and where they are flotating. And indeed, particularly for the Baltic states, Germany is country number one in terms of economy, in terms of political influence, and it explains why my argument that, about Euro-Atlanticism still, from my point of view, is very important, because we are in the state of permanent shift. And for small countries, this permanent state of shift is very, very complicated, tricky political exercise. And indeed, NATO, from that perspective, seems relatively simple. And we are doing our job, and we really are dealing with the most pressing issues. But when it comes to the EU, we do not know exactly where the EU is going with this security and defense package. Probably it can fail. And probably we'll have another French leader who again will have ambitious plans, and in words it will be grand. But on the other hand, there are other countries which are building some kind of their own strategy. So therefore, yeah, for small states right now, we have to be very innovative, very flexible, and very, very fast.
Thank you very much, especially on this assessment of NATO being actually quite clear and already having a clear security agenda, as opposed to the European Union, which is constantly shifting. But the comment that Edward Lucas made about the cooperation in the Baltic States, I sort of heard some criticism that the Baltic States are not cooperating enough and they have troubles of working together. What is your take on this? How about the Baltic States, and what could they do? We have also one question from the audience, which reads, what are the most important aspects within foreign policy and defense that the Baltics should work together on?
Mm-hmm. I very often mention the saying that Baltic states are not sisters. They are partners, like all countries, with their own interests and with their own policies. And sometimes there is this expectation that the Baltic states, it's one united entity which thinks alike and acts alike, which definitely is not true. But if we would like to at least to have a short overview of what is the state of affairs with the Baltic cooperation, then still I should say that within the area of defense, it's definitely, cooperation definitely is the best. There are a lot of arguments about joint procurement, where it's needed or not. But if we look at concrete projects about the progress in defense sector, then cooperation is good. However, of course, it's based on national interest. It's not perfect, but it definitely is in a very good shape. When it comes to other sectors, then we can find a lot of troubles. Either it's energy sector, Lithuanian colleagues know very well. When it comes very often to our position vis-a-vis our neighbors, some countries can be softer, some can be tougher. But still, in the end, there are no such urgent issues which could bring countries apart. Still, this consultation mechanism is very strong. And not the last point is that to a very large extent, very many issues depend on personalities. And you can find politicians, ministers of defense, of foreign affairs who are getting along very well, and they can reach consensus very easily. But then you can have ministers and also senior political leadership which dislike each other, and they have a lot of troubles, like look at Rail Baltica. So there were a lot of troubles exactly on the personal level. So I would say that still, if we look at different regional arrangements within at least around our neighborhood in Europe, the Baltic state cooperation is definitely a very good shape.
Thank you very much. I think we have two other questions from the audience, and one is about the US troop withdrawal from Germany and redislocation of them across Eastern Europe. What would be the meaning of this for the NATO's Western flank? And I think Martin Swarovski is ready to answer this question.
Yes, thank you for the floor. I think that partial withdrawal of the forces from Germany is logical, because it is, I think, part of the process that was initiated at the beginning of year by Minister of Defense, Mr. Esper, which should review the global force posture of the United States. It is, I think, the question states properly that is part of this redislocation. We need to accept the fact that, for instance, the meaning of the of Middle East and Africa changed in U.S. Strategy. So U.S. army in Germany is not only for protection of Germany, of the territory, but should enable also a project of power. So it's clear that if United States are going to withdraw or ship their command structures for projecting power in Africa and the Middle East is logical. And let's say Eastern flank, the question was about Western flank. Eastern flank, our countries, does not have any problems with, let's say, withdrawing some command structure for Africa or the Middle East. The problem would be if United States really withdraw this second infantry, I mean this striker brigade, because it is substantial combat force for Eastern flank contingency. So we will see what kind of shape this withdrawal will have after the presidential election. But as I said, this is what I'm really afraid of. If they withdraw this substantial combat forces, the second infantry, it will be a problem. But as I said, part of is also logical, and shifting of some command structure from Stuttgart to Mons to Belgium, because the command is double-headed. It's also for NATO command. It's also logical. So I would not see this as some, let's say, tragedy or some sign of weakening transatlantic relations. We need to accept the fact that generally, and it was related to one of your questions, Emilia, at the beginning, about the withdrawal of the United States. I do not see any withdrawal of the United States. I see a redislocation, reshuffling, and new tactics. What we see, for instance, in Syria, but similar also in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it is not withdrawal. It is implying what we call offshore balancing in practice. So we will keep only necessary assets, couple of advisors, trainers, special troops. You will employ some safe zones, but you need to have enough kinetic power in vessels in the region. So again, about Navy, in order to act kinetically if you need. So I think the Syria is perfect example of offshore balancing. And I think we need to accept the fact that United States will employ this offshore balancing and this what they call dynamic force posture globally. So it will be connected with the reduction of their forces in Africa, also in their forces in Europe, but it is because of the fact that they are not able to keep anymore their strategy that they had since the Second World War. That means that the US Army needs to have a capability to conduct two major wars at once, like they did in the Second World War, right? One in Europe, one in the Pacific region. They are slowly losing this ability, and we will witness the strategy of offshore balancing and dynamic force employment globally. We need to accept, and reshuffling of their forces in Germany is part of the process, as simply a matter of fact.
Thank you very much. It looks like a optimistic analysis that the United States is not really retreating, but it's only but we are facing the reconfiguration of its forces in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And I guess it goes together well with your analysis, which you gave before, that what we should do is participate more actively with the United States in reconfiguring the NATO tasks and maybe reshuffling and redividing the tasks within NATO, if I understand you correctly.
Only one sentence, but we should not do it just for the sake of our, let's say, for the alliance, for United States, but for ourselves. So I think to employ, let's say, dynamic force posture is also in our own interest. This is what I'm saying. And sometimes if you do imply this, let's say, reshuffling or offshore balancing very quickly, like in case in Syria, it can have also negative impact, because I think it was a logical, but it was not properly maybe prepared before, and lost a lot of casualties and lives of Kurds. So it can have a negative implication, no doubt about that. But as I said, we should just adjust also for increasing our own resilience.
Precisely, and this is what Edward Lucas also mentioned in his speech. The way that the security, or the way that politics is managed in the United States today is a bit unpredictable. So your analysis is based on very rational sort of thinking, but is the American administration strong enough to counterbalance the unpredictable moves of the American president? Do you think that?
Maybe, okay, if you look at national security strategy, national defense strategy, nuclear posture review, these are all the documents approved by the Congress, as Janeta and Edward rightly put so. So that means there is a consensus. This is approved by the Congress. So presidents, I think we should not overestimate the personalization of the US foreign policy, because the administration needs approval of the Congress, and there is a bipartisan consensus. So, but unpredictability, it's also, I think, matter of fact, what as Janeta rightly mentions. I think I was a policy planner. You know, I spent half of my career as a policy planner, and in policy planning 10 or 15 years ago, very sexy approach was trying to have a strategic foresight. You know, you had a new project on strategic foresight, new departments inside the intelligence of strategic foresight. I think 2014 and Crimea was major blow to the strategic foresight. So now I think to predict something that is qualitatively completely new, it is not in capability of human brain. So what we need now, instead of strategic foresight, is rather rapid reaction system, because we will face again situation that we were not able to predict. So we need to have a strategic, let's say, a rapid reaction system in terms of intelligence, policy planning, and also military capabilities and decision-making process.
I think Edward has a reaction to that.
Yes, I very much agree with you that strategic foresight is clearly nonsense, just as economic forecasting is clearly nonsense, because if it worked, the people who did it would be extremely rich, and then they wouldn't need to work in economic forecasting or strategic foresight. And it's like astrology. Clearly, it's not, there's no empirical basis to show it works. And but I also think the opposite of strategic foresight is not to have rapid reaction, because that's too passive. We don't want to sit and wait until things happen to us. We need to have plans about what we want to do and then go and implement them. And I think that the policy towards both towards Russia and towards China has been deplorably reactive. And both these, the regimes in both Moscow and Beijing, have had the initiative all the time. And they've had the initiative in Russia since Putin came to power, and in China since Xi. And I think we should, one of the first things to take a tennis analogy, we should be on the front foot, not the back foot. And this is very important. And I would like to see in the Nordic-Baltic region a dynamic, active foreign policy, which then gets me on, perhaps, Emilia, can I answer the question about the 17+1?
Definitely.
So I think that there's a question, the benefits of 17+1 are almost non-existent. Would it be better to leave this format in order to strengthen the transatlantic alliance? I think it would be, it's probably not a good idea just to leave the 17+1, but I think we should, the Atlanticist countries should send fairly low-level representation. I mean, not prime ministers or presidents, but transport ministers and people like that, mainly to keep an eye on what's happening, and should try very hard to boost 3Cs as a rival organization. And 3Cs should become a bigger organization. We should be trying to get Ukraine in, for example, Moldova, and it should widen its approach from just physical connectivity to data and also to other things. I've just shared a link which is, I think, on the chat, which everyone can see, alerting you to the next diplomatic happening. Speaker of the Taiwanese Parliament, Mr. Yu Si-kun, I've probably mispronounced his name, but he wants to visit the Baltic States. This is following the commendable visit of Miloš Vystrčil to Taipei last week. And I think this is a great opportunity for the Baltic States, and in fact the Nordic region as well, to say, yes, we're not going to put up with bullying by the People's Republic of China. Now, it may not be possible for heads of government or heads of state to meet him, but there's nothing stopping speakers of parliament and MPs in their individual capacity meeting him. I also think it'd be a very good idea to take this opportunity for the 3 Baltic states to open a joint economic and cultural mission to Taipei. This is completely allowed under One China policy to have a non-state representation in Taipei, and it wouldn't cost very much to do it. And I would think this would be an excellent example both of Baltic diplomatic cooperation, which is not particularly good, and as a way of signalling that the Baltic states have skin in the game when it comes to these much bigger issues. So I will stop. I think we're almost out of time. If someone wants to ask me a question, I'll answer it, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Janetta, do you have comments on this?
Yeah, I would like to comment a little bit the 17+1 format. It seems to me it's very artificial from the very beginning, because if you look at the countries which constitute those 17, they are very diverse. If you look at real achievements or what has been done so far, then these are mostly countries with low economic performance, which benefited from few Chinese investments. In other countries, we could talk about Chinese soft powers presence, and I even don't use this word influence, but at least attempts to influence society, but it didn't have very big impact at all. So I think also Chinese, to a very large extent, lost interest in those countries which are part of the EU, because it's not so easy to invest according to Chinese standards in EU member states. You have to follow certain rules, you have to follow certain procurement procedures, and so on. So therefore, as just a format to discuss issues, to talk, yes, why not? But in real terms, actually nothing is happening. And therefore, most probably, indeed, some other activities should be considered, some other policies also rediscovered how to deal with China. Because if I look in real terms, what happened between China and Latvia, or China, Estonia, China, Lithuania, under the 17+1 format, nothing big, yeah, just political dialogue, which is relevant, no doubts about that, but otherwise, it's sort of artificial.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of other questions. I think we have until 12 maximum for our discussion, so we still have some time. We have two other questions. One is raising Ukraine. What would be the consequences for Ukraine for, of this changing nature of US leadership? Do you have any thoughts on that? Anyone?
Well, I think that Ukraine's depended very much on American support over the years, and there's sometimes when I go to Kiev, I get this feeling that Ukrainians are waiting for America and the West to sort out their problems, and that's not a very healthy healthy attitude and a healthy relationship, and we've seen it in other ex-captive nations as well. The big problems facing Ukraine are in Ukraine, and it's not just the war in the east, it's corruption, rule of law, institution building, oligarchs, civil rights, center energy reform of the energy sector, center periphery relations. And these are all things, Russia is not stopping Ukraine solving those ones. Russia is the military problem in the east. But I think that President Zelensky's got to get, and his government have got to get on with solving the practical problems in Ukraine. Some outside expertise and assistance is welcome, and I think Lithuania again should be praised for the enormous efforts of people like former Prime Minister Kubilius and others, Mr. Abramovich, who've put a lot of effort into helping Ukraine. But in the end, Ukraine's a big country. They've got plenty of people. They're not short of human resources. The IMF has bailed out the economy again, and they have to get on with it. And I think the best advice for them is not to get involved insofar as they can in American politics. It's interesting that Mr. President Zelensky got into this problem with President Trump because he was desperate to be invited to the White House. And if he'd thought, well, look, yeah, if they want to see me, they want to see me, but I've got plenty to do here, then he wouldn't have been sucked into this thing. If you want to come to the White House, but we want you to open a bogus investigation against Hunter Biden. So I think that with this toxicity, and this personal toxicity or personalized toxicity at the heart of American politics, this is a very good reason for always asking yourself, do I actually need this? Maybe the best thing is to have good relations with Congress, maybe good relations to the Secretary of State, with the Secretary of Defense. But these relationships with the White House come at a price, and I think Ukraine has learned a painful lesson from that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It looks like Ukraine and Russia are not very much in the sphere of interests of Western powers, the United States and European powers as well. So would the solution be to live with what we have, or should we still continue lobbying these countries for the attention to this region? Martin, you have a comment.
Yes, I have a comment on Ukraine. Part of my responsibility while still at MFA was transferring our know-how to our Eastern European neighbors within the Eastern Partnership. So my field of responsibility was also public administration reform. So we provided our know-how in terms of public administration reform to Eastern partners and Ukrainians. So since then, I had really access to, I would say, profound assessment of the achievements from regarded audit companies as well as some other organizations. So I would challenge what was said by Edward here. They did a substantial and really a great progress in coping with corruption. They changed the legislation. They have new capabilities, new structures. They made a substantial progress in terms of access to information. They had changes also on the local administration, on the local level. State administration on the local level. It needs to be acknowledged. They need now sometimes we should not always force them every day to other reforms. This needs to be really acknowledged. What they need is also they need success. They need protection, and it's as simple as that. They desperately needed lethal weapons. They got it from the United States. So Europe was reluctant. I'm not sure whether it will be what will be the case in Biden administration, taken into account Democrats were always opposing. So simply they made a trick. They stopped the aggression due to little weapons that they got from the United States, and they have now excellent. Probably this is the army with the best experience with direct combat. Right, and they need money, and what they need is not only, let's say, subsidies and loans from International Monetary Fund or World Bank or European Union. They need direct foreign investment, and probably the only really country that does systematic way support its own national investment in Ukraine is Germany. You have more than 5,000 of German companies there. They are really investing not only in the western part of the country, but eastern part and central part of the country. So we should follow this German example because they need investment. And I think what, if we spoke about Europe, what is the problem with this regionalization is that I think you mentioned, Emilia, France has its own different threat assessment and different interests. We should accept that, but we should try to have our own agenda and to negotiate with France. Last time, when this region, our part of the region, presented some really strategic idea, was the Eastern Partnership 11 years ago. Since then, nothing. And nowadays, if France was very successful in persuading Germany to go with them in Africa, to have all this Marshall Plan for Africa and trust funds, okay, we can join, but then we should suggest our own, let's say, agenda that will have the same strategic importance like Africa has for France. We should maybe suggest some Marshall Plan for Ukraine, because success of Ukraine is strategically important for our resilience. I mean, resilience of the Eastern Flank. But I've understood. Let's say we should not always steadily block, criticize, and oppose all these, French initiatives like intervention initiative, strategic autonomy whatsoever, German for Africa. No, we should have our own, and then to negotiate with France and trying to have Germans on board. I think this is very critical because nothing is perfect in Ukraine. It's clear, but as I said, they made substantial progress, and their success is in our own interest.
Yes, I would probably agree with you that it is important to keep the dialogue with the other European countries as well. And one of the examples which is quite outstanding for example, in the Baltic States is Estonia, who has been very active in cooperating with France for the European Defence Initiative, also sending troops to their operation in Mali.
We have a command in Mali, I mean Czech Republic.
There we go. There we go. So I'm wondering.
Latvians as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Janeta, what do you think about this? Is this a strategy for the Baltic states and you know for countries in the Central Europe to work to go into this sort of, is this part of transactional approach where we give something to the big European powers and we expect their solidarity for the issues that are important to us? And you know, how do you see this?
I think we have to go back to 2004 when the Baltic states joined the European Union, because till 2004 almost the whole foreign policy was taken by efforts to join the EU and NATO. So therefore foreign policy was very straightforward, and other regions and other countries probably were left somewhere in the further corner. After 2004, the foreign policy thinking was changing because the Baltic states were learning from the diversity of regional interests of EU member states. At the point when France initiated the Mediterranean Union, suddenly the Baltic states woke up and said, oh, if there is Mediterranean Union, we need something also which would serve our interests. So therefore, actually, the foreign policy, to a very large extent, was targeted at our neighboring country, and then Eastern Partnership came in. But then more and more, we became, let's say, solid and rooted EU members. We realized that it's very important to find compromise in order to satisfy our own interests. So therefore, I think that now all three Baltic states, of course, their priority is still somewhere on our east, but there are always different policy efforts which support interests of bigger European countries like France, Germany, or Spain. So whenever there are appeals to participate in one or another mission or operation, the Baltic states try, at least symbolically, to do something in order to get, again, support to our initiatives as well. But when it comes to Ukraine, I don't think that something huge will change in US-Ukrainian relations after elections, because there are certain limits, how far and what you can do. But I also agree with what Ed said, that actually solution in the hands of Ukrainians themselves, how persistent and how committed they will be to reforms. And I also, like Martin, I was involved in several projects related to public administration, to education, and also to corruption issues. And formally, if we follow legislation process, institution transformation, public administration competences, yes, they really invested a lot and they achieved a lot. But in order to make reforms function, people have to become participants of those reforms. Not only some kind of supporters on the side, but those who are actively participating, implementing, and also benefiting from those reforms. And there certainly is a gap between those who are adopting very good pro-European laws and implementation process. And unfortunately, also, it will not be the US or France or Germany who will be in charge for the implementation. These are Ukrainians themselves.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we take another last question from the audience, which is about the expectations of the American presidential elections and what would be expected if Joe Biden is elected, for, you know, what would be the perspectives for the NATO's Eastern Flank. and then we will probably wrap up the discussion with final remarks. So, what about the possibilities of election of Joe Biden and future perspectives?
I will probably start. I don't think that in terms of Eastern Flank, if we take it from defense perspective, that something substantially will change, because it is a long-term American commitment to participate in Eastern Flank and its defense. So therefore, no big changes, but probably political narrative will be more encouraging and most probably more sympathetic to public, because at the present moment there probably are very good narratives sent to military, but still in Latvian society those narratives are not quite clear. So I think with the Biden, this division between what messages are sent to military and what to wider audience will merge.
Thank you. Martin, you mentioned the propensity of American Democrats to be reserved on certain issues. Do you have any different views on Joe Biden's elections?
I can fully subscribe to what has been said by Janeta. Every word I agree with. Still, I think there is one question mark, and this is if Biden win. By the way, I'm not that sure that he will win, but if he wins, we will need to wait until January to see what people come to the administration, and it will be also decisive what kind of people will be, let's say, at the top of the Democratic Party. So if there will be really a left inside the democratic country, and I'm afraid it might be the case, we can see more pressure on savings, on cuttings on military budget. Even now, during negotiation of the next fiscal year, Bernie Sanders suggested 10% cuts in the defense budget, devoted for, let's say, some social affairs and so on and so forth. So we can evade this pressure. So, but as I said, we need to wait simply which people from Democratic Party will come to the decisive post in the administration. So the question, what kind of consequences it will have if Biden's prevail, will still be remained, let's say, under the new administration is formed.
Thank you.
But as I said, the level of continuity will be quite high, and return to Obama policy is not possible. Return to reset or pivot to Asia in its original Obama shape is not possible anymore.
I think that in one sense, it's not as bad as it looks under Trump. It wasn't as good as it looked under Biden, under Obama, and it won't be as good as we hope under Biden, because these problems have quite deep roots. The structural difficulties, which I mentioned at the beginning with the transatlantic relationship. I think that in terms of the US force posture in Europe, things haven't gone badly. I mean, actually more happened under Trump than people realized. I don't think the US military is particularly short of money. They waste enormous amounts, and I think I'd be in favor of a 10% cut in the defense budget. Actually, I think there are other things that they need to spend money on more. And fundamentally, the confrontation with Russia and the confrontation with China is not really about the amount of money you spend on defense. It's about how strong your alliances and your resilience and your societies and your economies are. Nobody put tanks on the streets of London and said, open the city of London to Russian dirty money. and nobody put tanks on the streets of the United States and said, open your economy to Chinese technology. We just did it to ourselves because we were greedy and lazy and whatever. We can stop being greedy and lazy, and we don't need defense budget money for that. I think the problem really is about the high-level political credibility of the United States. And this is difficult because Trump has damaged the fundamental values that underpin the Atlantic Alliance. You can still say we need America because we're scared of Russia, or we need America because we're scared of China. But the idealistic side of the Atlantic Alliance, which I think it fundamentally is very important, because this isn't a sort of about being selfish and scared. Ultimately, it's because we believe in democracy and the rule of law and so on. And that took a hit. I mean, I would argue it took a hit under Clinton for other reasons and so on. But I think that Trump has degraded the ideological basis of the West, and Biden to some extent may restore it, although that remains to be seen. There's also the question of deterrence. Is the United States really willing to go to war for its allies? That took a big hit under Trump, and on that there's no substitute for the Oval Office. Congress is not going to, if you have a provocation, little green men appear in Adutiškis or Vieniškis or one of these other little border anomalies that Lithuania has, or if you have some other provocation, whatever Congress takes, it's the question of the Oval Office, of whether you immediately respond with big American deployments, raising readiness and so on. And if Trump says, I'm not bothered by this, that's a really fundamental problem for our plan A. That's why we need our plan B and plan C. And I think with Biden, the assurance of American support for allies is much, much higher. So that is a major contributor to our deterrence. And for that reason, I think that would be good. It would on balance be good for the allies if Biden wins, although many of the other problems, as I say, won't go away.
Thank you very much. So I think we should wrap our discussion up. Maybe I can invite you to give some final remarks if there is anything that you want to add, and to finish up. Edward, maybe.
Think about Taiwan.
Okay. Janetta, would you have anything to add?
Don't forget our Eastern partners, not only Ukraine, but others as well.
Yes, thank you. And Martin?
I think that the major global threat, in my opinion, is growing doctrinal gap between the United States and Europe. And we will face implications of this growing gap again.
Thank you. Sorry. Is that your final remarks? Thank you very much, really, for this very interesting discussion. I think we touched upon different problems related to these changes in the U.S. global leadership. I think we, to summarize, I guess. We can conclude that the U.S. disengagement in Europe is not entirely definite, that there are mixed messages, so there is hope for continuing American engagement in our continent. We also said that we should do what we can do, concentrate on the most immediate issues which are abundant, and then we could also look for creative solutions, especially cooperating much more on the regional level within the Baltic states, but also involving the northern states and also the allies in the Central Europe. NATO continues to be the framework, apparently, in which we, the small states, should work in. So it is important to continue to strengthen this alliance, even if we reconfigure the division of roles inside the alliance itself. So we should be open to creative solutions, and at the same time keep an eye on shifting interests within the European Union and in the the great power game as well, keeping an eye on the US developments in the US and also in China. And then we should also work together with our allies, with the United States and with the Europeans as well, and have China as well in our focus to be able to cooperate on this policy. So I think that this is quite an agenda, and I hope that this discussion has been useful. And thank you very much once again, Lukas, Żaneta Ozolna, and Martin Swarovski.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed very much the discussion and perfect moderation.
Thank you, Emilia.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.